So, hello, BookTube. This is Mika, and this is the Seriously Well Read tag. This was created by Randy at Illiterate Texan. So, the first question is, what book made you take reading seriously? And he talks about The Lord of the Rings, he talks about The Hobbit, and he talks about how obviously The Hobbit is intended to be a children's book, and he read it as a kid. And look, I did the same. I read The Hobbit at about 11 years old, and at 10 years old, I was reading Roald Dahl, so I was reading more typically kiddies books, maybe with easier vocabulary, but I was also reading things that were classics. I read like the Anne of Green Gables series, and again, I read very widely as a kid. But if I look at myself now, I don't consider myself to be someone who takes reading seriously. I have a discipline about it. I'm constantly reading. I love it, and I read so called serious books, so literary fiction, non fiction, but it's not something I take seriously. Reading for me is a privilege, a joy, a pleasure, but not something I take seriously. If I felt like it was a chore or something I didn't enjoy, or if it was a drag, then I wouldn't do it because, my life is stressful enough. So I don't know if that's a really bad answer, but I don't take reading seriously. I think there needs to be a level of lightness and play when you approach your reading. So, again, maybe that's a stupid answer, but that is how I feel. So, question two is, what book did you pretend to understand? Be honest. Randy talks about L'Étrange by Albert Camus, or The Stranger, The Outsider, however you want to translate it. And he said no, he just didn't get it. I actually loved The Stranger, but my journey with it was very interesting. So I was in my early 20s and I read it and I thought, oh, okay, I can really identify with this character at first because he feels like an outsider in society. He doesn't understand society's norms, social hierarchies and norms and niceties and things like that are very confusing to him. So he masks to an extent, which I think like neurodivergence, autism, like all of these issues, there's parts of that you can identify with. I think the book even starts with him saying that no, he hates his mother, and we live in a society where people deify mothers, and a lot of people also have difficult relationships with mothers. So there were parts of myself that I could identify with in the character, but then he just shoots an Arab, and I was just shocked. It's like, what the fuck? What's wrong with you? And then I find myself sort of pathologizing the character like how he's been previously pathologized by all the other characters. So again, it was just such an interesting thing for me to examine of like, oh, okay, at what point did I draw the line? At what point did I begin to pathologize this character? And he complained of this constant pathologization within society, and so that was the reason why he didn't fit in. So it just leads me to think, at what point in society do we draw the line? Because society pathologized gay people. Society was very racist to a point. Still is, obviously. But again, it really made me think as a reader, at what point do I begin to pathologize people and no longer accept them and no longer, yeah. But at the same time, I also don't believe that acceptance of other individuals should be unconditional. You can't just go and shoot someone on the beach and then we as society must be fine with that at the same time. So The Stranger, again, I read it so long ago, brought up really interesting questions for me. But yeah. Anyway, to answer Randy's question, sorry, what book did I pretend to understand? There were two books that came to mind, but I was specifically thinking of Anna Karenina by Lev Tolstoy because, again, I read Anna Karenina. I must have been 20, 21, maybe 19, 20, 21, somewhere around there. And it's not that Anna Karenina is difficult to read line by line, it's long. And that for me is not an issue. I can easily read 1,000-page book, 500 pages, whatever. It's just a matter of setting aside the time, getting into the book, enjoying it. So that was not the issue for me. The issue for me was just that I didn't understand Anna Karenina as a character. Because how do you cheat on your husband, leave your husband, and then you're like, oh, Vronsky is going to abandon me. Oh no. It's like, well, you abandoned your husband. Are you projecting here or what's happening? And then again, she just goes like batshit at various points in time. So there was a scene with the horses or like the betting, whatever it was. And again, people have afterwards diagnosed Anna Karenina with BPD, borderline personality disorder, because she's got that extreme fear of abandonment and that envy and that jealousy and all of that. But that's just not really something that I understand. It's similar to Wuthering Heights. I think that's Emily Bronte, is it? Because I also read Jane Eyre. I love Jane Eyre, but did not understand Wuthering Heights because these are like such terrible people. So again, I was reading it and I was like, I don't understand why people get into romantic relationships. Especially if it's so horrible like this. Like, if you hate each other, why are you together? And yeah, in Anna Karenina, I just didn't like, I didn't get it, and I didn't get the appeal of that. Like, why would you want to be around such an individual that is so consumed by their own jealousy and envy? Again, I avoid those people like the plague because eventually they turn on you. I think I'm someone who's experienced and been on the receiving end of a lot of people's envy, and it's just exhausting to me. So when I was reading Anna Karenina, I'm like, this is just exhausting and draining. Not because it's hard to read line by line, not because I don't understand, not because it's long. Those are not barriers to entry for me. But I think the envy of that character of Anna was just too much for me. Yeah, I don't think I'll be reading another Tolstoy because, again, I also think that he did drag on a little bit. It was not necessarily, yeah, I don't know. For me, I don't feel that it was necessary to have such a chonker of a book. Yeah. Anna Karenina was not for me. I don't think I'm going to be reading War and Peace. Anyway, so which book did I pretend to understand? I didn't really pretend to understand it. I was just like, not for me. But yeah, question 3. Which 3 books are on your personal required reading list? So Randy talked about, I think Charles Dickens was. I don't like Dickens. He said the collected works of Shakespeare. For me, yes, collected works of Shakespeare. On my personal required reading. So this is not something I think you must read. It's something I think I must read. So again, collected works of Shakespeare. This is plays, sonnets, everything. But then my second one is Capital by Karl Marx. Not the Communist Manifesto, because communism, and when people have tried communism, my concern about that is the cultural imperialism. And at what point does the authoritarian left become too toxic for me to handle? Like, I'm not an authoritarian. I don't believe in that. Like, yeah, anyway, so I'm kind of just trying to figure out where I stand on the leftist spectrum, even though it's such a broad spectrum. So collected works of Shakespeare, Capital by Karl Marx. But the third one I'm gonna just leave for like the African literary canon altogether. What's on my personal required reading list, I don't know. I'm still very flexible as a reader, and I think I want to learn about African literary canon, but who is the canon? I think some people will read like one Chinua Achebe and then they think they're done, or like one Ben Okri and they think that they're done. But there's so much within the African continent. So I've read a fair amount of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I've read almost J.M. Coetzee's completed works. But again, I think my personal required reading is that I need to read a lot of African authors, plays, poetry, novels, all that kind of thing. Okay. What author have you been avoiding? I think there's 2 kinds of avoidance. The first one is I want to, but I'm intimidated. The other one is I definitely don't want to. Keep that book away from me. So the authors that I avoid, I tend to avoid American cultural imperialism and British cultural imperialism, i.e., it's not that I don't think American voices are important. I think they are. I think British voices are important. But if you don't put in the effort, you're not going to be reading anything from Central Asia. You're not going to be reading something from Indonesia or from, again, South Africa, because, again, that's my priority. So my priority is that I am a South African citizen, so I'll tend to focus on African literature. I tend to focus on female perspectives. Not that male perspectives are not important. They are. So I tend to avoid anything that's a giant commercial best-selling author with lots and lots of formulaic genre fiction books. I don't want to put names to that because, again, I don't mean to disparage anyone who enjoys that kind of thing. But again, genre fiction, cultural imperialism, like that's what I tend to avoid because I'm not interested at all. So keep that away from me. I'm avoiding it because I'm not interested. Authors that I've been avoiding because I'm intimidated, I don't think I just don't think that's an issue. Like, I believe that there is timing, and that when you are ready, you will go to the book. So I think forcing and pushing yourself and making reading into a chore, that's just not something that works for me and for my approach, because I'm naturally a very driven person. I'm a very curious person, so I don't necessarily need to push myself. Um, yeah. And if anyone tries to push me, I will push back. So, yeah. Question 5 is, what's the hardest book that you've ever finished? This is a very difficult question, because what is hard? Like, I've read Shakespeare on my own, and I don't find it hard. I think you read the footnotes, you read it, you get the gist of it, or maybe you read Shakespeare once, get the general gist of it, read it a second time, get the attention to detail, maybe read it a third time, revisit, whatever you want to do, like whatever your approach is. So what does hard mean? Does hard mean that the language is inaccessible? Does it mean it's a long book? Does it mean, so what's the hardest book that you've ever finished? I don't know that I can even answer this question, but I suppose things like Finnegan's Wake, things like James Joyce might be hard. I think Marcel Proust is also described as hard, but I have read some of him and I don't find him to necessarily be very difficult. I've read Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. I don't find him difficult. Your very dense leftist texts, again, I don't necessarily find them too. So I don't really know how to answer this question, so I'm just going to move on. Question 6 is, what is a book that changed how you read? I think every book that I read changes me in some way. So I look at the world anew every time I've read a new book. I come in with a better understanding of other people's inner worlds. I become a more empathetic person through reading, at least that's what I believe. And so the way that I read further fiction or non-fiction is forever changed, and it's not necessarily something that I can go back to how I previously used to be. So, for example, like if I read a Sindire Magona book, she talks about the structural challenges that she deals with racism within South Africa and obviously beyond, in the world beyond. So you can be fiercely intelligent, but you will still have institutional issues. So being a woman and being black at the same time. So again, once I read this, you can't unsee what you saw through the book. So that, for example, or if I read, now I'm not, okay, so there's Chuck Palahniuk, who is an American author, and I think there was one book that I picked up of his, and from the first page, the child was using slurs, like chaps and chinks and that kind of terminology, which, I don't know, for me it's just unacceptable. Like, how, I don't know, I can't bring myself to read a book like that. So what's a book that changed how you read? Every book changes me in some way. I become intolerant to prejudice. I become intolerant to bigoted thinking. So yeah, I don't know, every book changes the way I read. I'm so sorry if that's again a very irritating, boring answer. Question 7 is, quality versus quantity. Would you rather read 100 good books in a year or 10 great books? So it's very easy to look at this and say, no, I want to read 10 great books. But what is 10 great books? How do you develop taste? How do you develop discernment? You actually do that through volume. So reading 100 good books, I think, especially when you're a child, like when I was a child, I would be reading in volume. And that volume helped me. The collective impact and effect of 100 good books versus 10 great books, the collective impact was fantastic and was amazing, because the vocabulary that you develop from reading, the reasoning, the logic, the critical thinking, the empathy, the media literacy, all of these things that you develop from reading 100 good books, I don't think that you've ever lost time or that you've wasted time by reading. So again, even if it is 100 good books as opposed to 10 great books, because the question is, what is great? Who discerns that? Who defines that? Because if you're only looking at literary critics to define that, a lot of them have a very curated taste, and it's not that they have better taste than other people, but that they've all studied in the same institution which prioritizes the same cultural imperialistic literature. So again, what is great books? How do you define 10 great books? Again, this is just the way that I think. I think in a very analytical way. So when I look at this question, I'm not going to take it at surface value. So, sure, I would like to rather read 10 great books as opposed to 100 good books, but I don't know if I would consider any book to be a waste of time or to be a waste of effort or waste of engagement on my side. So, yeah. Question 8. What genre are you embarrassed to say that you have not read? I'm not embarrassed about my reading. I own it. I, as a reader, own my subjectivity and where I am. It is what it is. If you like it, great. If you don't like it, maybe this channel is not for you. I don't think we should be embarrassed as readers. I think we are all subjective. We all come from a biased perspective. Rather own that bias and admit to it than be embarrassed and try and suppress it and whatever. Question 9. What book do you think that most people misread? Again, who decides what is the correct interpretation of a book? There's a lot of power dynamics and structures within that of who decides is the right interpretation and the wrong interpretation. I'm not saying that because there's a lot of times where the interpretation is manifestly unfounded and it's manifestly wrong. Like you are illiterate or you have no media literacy. Like I'm not saying that that doesn't exist. You can misread books. But again, who gets that final say on whether the book has been misread or not? So it's a concern to me because access to literacy, access to education, there are power structures manifest in that. And so who gets to say? So again, I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm going to say, when you're looking at questions like this, ask yourself about these power structures that will be invisible unless you put them under the microscope. Okay, so question 10. What does seriously well read mean to you? So yeah, Randy has this concept on his channel about being well read and well rounded as a reader. Randy has collaborated with Steve Donahue, and Steve Donahue has a very male Western American kind of perspective, on what the great literary canon and the Western literary canon is, and all this grandiose terminology that Steve Donahue uses. It's not that I think all of that is irrelevant. I think it's relevant. I think it's important to read books that have stood the test of time. But again, one must ask oneself, why did it stand the test of time? Think about the cultural imperialism manifest in that, and why it stood the test of time, and the printing press and access to that and access to literacy, who was allowed the right to read, who was denied that right, whose language was shoved down whose throat. History is written by the victor. I think one must critically consider those things. Virginia Woolf used a thought experiment saying that if Shakespeare had a sister, then her literary imprint would not have survived because of gender bias and gender privilege. So again, take that and multiply that by 10, because a lot of people are not only women but also have other intersectional identities. So I think this concept of well read, and if one only looks at it from a very white male Western lens, then you're missing out on a lot of the literary canon. The novel was initially considered to be frivolous and for women. So the first person who wrote a novel, I believe, was a Japanese woman, and non-fiction was only for men. Men read serious things, they read non-fiction, and women read frivolous fiction. And when there was American nation building, I don't know which American president it was, but he would talk about the great American novel, and then suddenly men took over, the novel, and it became a male thing. But it was appropriated from a feminine art form. So I think one must look critically at this history, not suppress this history, but look it in the eye and ask yourself, who gets to decide what's in the canon and why? And who is left out of the canon and why? So I didn't do this tag to disparage Randy or disparage Steve or anything like that. But again, I think just look critically at the things that you're reading. not just at the line, like line by line level when you're looking critically at what the author is saying, but again, look at who was left out of the canon. So, by BookTube, that is the video.